The bouquet was still mid-air when the boy's voice shattered the silence. "She's my mom!" Every head turned. The music froze. The bride stopped mid-smile, clutching her veil. And there, standing on a velvet chair with his small hands shaking, 8-year-old Ethan pointed across the garden. Not at the bride, not at a guest, but at a woman in a faded uniform, tears on her cheeks, and a truth no one was ready for. Just an hour earlier, Grace Turner had blended into the background, as she always did. Among crystal glasses, tailored suits, and perfectly curated smiles, she moved quietly, just the help, expected to stay out of sight. It was Jonathan Blake's wedding day after all. A high-profile tech executive marrying Vanessa Whitmore, a rising influencer with connections and opinions about everything, including the people allowed near her. Grace wasn't a guest. She was the nanny, and for most of her life she'd accepted that role, quietly, gratefully. But today something cracked, a whisper that wasn't meant to be heard, a truth kept buried too long. And Ethan, the little boy she raised from diapers, heard it all. This is the story of how one woman spent a lifetime in the shadows until the child she loved stepped into the light. But in that moment, she had no idea what was coming. Grace Turner didn't come from much. She grew up learning to stay quiet, to be helpful, to be needed, but never noticed. At 17, she made a decision that haunted her every single day since, signing the papers at a county hospital, handing over her newborn because no one in her life believed she could raise him. She didn't know who took him. She wasn't allowed to ask. Years later, through a twist of fate or maybe something bigger, she took a job as a live-in nanny for Jonathan Blake, a man recently widowed, raising a toddler alone. She didn't know the boy's name before the interview. She didn't know until she walked into the nursery and saw him. Ethan, his eyes, his dimples, even the faint birthmark on his arm. Her knees nearly gave out. But she smiled, said she had experience with children, and accepted the job. She never said a word. Over the next 6 years, Grace became everything to Ethan. She held his hand through night terrors, packed his school lunches with handwritten notes, knew exactly which toy he reached for when he was scared. She never asked for recognition. She was there to love him quietly, from the shadows. Jonathan never suspected a thing. He was always in meetings, always traveling, always trusting Grace to handle the small stuff. And Vanessa, she never liked Grace from the beginning. "She's too attached to the boy," Vanessa once whispered to Jonathan, loud enough for Grace to hear. "It's unhealthy." Today, as white roses lined the aisle and photographers snapped staged moments, Grace stayed behind the scenes. She had helped Ethan into his tiny tuxedo that morning, tied his shoes, kissed his forehead. "Stay close, okay?" he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. But the wedding brought more than vows. It brought looks, comments. People like Vanessa's sister laughing near the champagne table. "Who invited the maid to the wedding?" Grace pretended not to hear. She lowered her head and stepped back, like always. But somewhere in the crowd, Ethan was listening, watching. And Grace, exhausted, heart full and breaking, let slip the words she thought no one would hear. "I just wish I could call you mine." Grace never dreamed of wealth or praise. All she ever wanted was the chance to be enough for someone, to belong, not as a helper but as family. She used to imagine a parallel life, one where she never signed those papers, one where Ethan ran to her yelling "Mom" instead of Grace. But that was a life she gave up, a life she didn't deserve. Still, every morning she woke up in the small room behind the laundry area, and every night she whispered goodnight to Ethan like it was a prayer. She packed extra snacks he didn't ask for. She remembered which pajamas he called his lucky ones. She never forgot a detail, because that's what mothers do. And today, on his father's wedding day, all she wanted was to see him smile. The garden ceremony was filled with muted laughter and the clinking of glass. Guests wore designer labels and traded stories about yachts and hedge funds. Grace stood by the catering tent, her dress modest, her shoes worn at the edges. But she smiled when Ethan caught her eye. From across the lawn, He waved. That was all she needed. Until the whispers started. "She's still here?" someone muttered. "Didn't they say she was just temporary?" Near the fountain, Vanessa sipped her champagne and sneered. "Jonathan has a soft spot for strays," she joked to her bridesmaids. "After today, we're upgrading everything, including childcare." They laughed, loud enough for Grace to hear. She kept her eyes down, took a deep breath. She didn't flinch. Not yet. But then Vanessa walked over, smiling with poison on her lips. "You should be in the back," she said sweetly. "This isn't really your place, you know." Grace nodded, said nothing, just turned around. But behind the drink station near the side of the house, she stopped. The pressure in her chest finally cracked. Her hands shook. Her throat burned. She whispered, not to anyone but to herself. Maybe to God. "If you only knew, I would have given anything to call him mine." She didn't know a small pair of eyes was just around the corner, listening. Frozen. Ethan had wandered off, searching for her. He heard the words, all of them. He stood there, still as stone, heart pounding. His face said what his voice didn't yet know how to say. He knew. Grace didn't cry easily. Years of holding herself together made her a master of silence. But behind the hedge, near the catering station, with music echoing and laughter bubbling from the crowd, she felt her chest cave in. She clutched the corner of a table to steady herself. Her knees buckled just slightly, enough for her to know she needed to disappear. Inside the house, down the hallway past the guest bathrooms, she found a storage room and slipped inside. It smelled like lavender and old wood. She closed the door and sat on a step stool, pulling her hands to her chest like armor. She had survived worse, but something about this, the cruel laughter, the dismissal, the feeling of being replaceable even to Ethan, cut deeper than she expected. Grace wasn't foolish. She knew this wedding meant goodbye. Vanessa had made it clear she wanted her out. Jonathan, always polite but distant, wouldn't fight for her. She wouldn't get to explain, wouldn't get to hold Ethan one more time, wouldn't get to say, "I'm proud of you, my son," her son. Her hands trembled as she reached into her apron pocket, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. Ethan had drawn it a year ago, crayon scribbles of a little boy holding hands with a woman wearing a blue dress. The sky was green, the grass was purple, but the smile on the woman's face was unmistakable. On top, in uneven handwriting, "Me and Mom." He had handed it to her and said, "Oops, I meant to write Grace," but she kept it. And in secret, she never corrected him. Her breath hitched. She pressed the drawing to her heart. Outside, applause rang out. The vows had ended. The first dance was beginning. And Ethan... Where was Ethan? She stood up to check the time, to get back into the routine like she always did, when a knock startled her. "Grace?" It was one of the servers. "Jonathan asked for the cake. Can you bring it to the back patio?" Her voice caught in her throat. "Of course," she managed. She straightened her dress, wiped beneath her eyes, and slid the drawing back into her pocket. By the time she returned to the back patio, the music had changed. Everyone had gathered for the cake cutting. Jonathan stood beside Vanessa, smiling politely. The photographer hovered nearby. Ethan stood off to the side, clutching something in his hand. Grace stayed hidden behind a curtain of ivy draped over the pergola. She was invisible again. Then it happened. Ethan moved. He stepped forward, climbed onto a white-painted chair, lifted his chin, and shouted, voice trembling but clear, "She's not the nanny, she's my mom." The crowd stopped. No music, no forks clinking, just silence. Vanessa blinked rapidly, as if the air had just been knocked out of her. Jonathan turned, face drained of color. Grace froze. Ethan climbed down and walked straight toward her, still holding the crayon drawing, the one she thought she'd hidden. He reached her, eyes wide and sure. "I heard you," he said quietly. "Behind the house. You said I was yours." Grace opened her mouth, but no sound came. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he added. "I remember. I always knew." She knelt to his level, tears spilling freely now. "Ethan, I wanted to tell you. I wanted to so many times." He leaned in, forehead against hers. "Then say it now. Say you're my mum." Her breath shook as she whispered, "I'm your mum, baby." "Okay," he nodded. "Then let's go tell everyone else." "Aye, and what about you? Have you ever loved someone from the shadows, silently, fiercely, without the world knowing what that person meant to you? Tell your story in the comments. Sometimes your truth might be exactly what someone else needs to finally speak theirs." For the first time in years, Grace didn't look away. She stood next to Ethan, her hand still holding his, and faced the sea of frozen expressions, faces that once looked through her now locked on her, like she was the scandal of the century. She could hear gasps, whispers, the buzz of phone cameras. Vanessa's voice, sharp and furious, rose in the background, but Grace didn't flinch. She looked down at Ethan. His small fingers gripped hers tightly, as if he had known this day would come before she ever dared believe it. "I don't want to be a secret anymore," he said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper just for her. Neither did she. She hadn't prepared for this. No speech, no plan. Only the sound of her own heart, racing and raw, telling her to stop running. Jonathan stepped forward slowly, eyes unreadable. The weight of the room shifted toward him. Grace braced herself for what she thought would come next: anger, dismissal, blame. Instead, he simply said, "We need to talk, all three of us." It wasn't kindness, exactly, but it wasn't rejection either. That alone stunned her. He gestured toward the house, away from the crowd, and Grace followed, Ethan between them, still clutching the drawing like a flag in a war no one saw coming. Inside, the music faded behind thick doors. The chaos of the crowd became a distant murmur. They walked into Jonathan's study, dark wood walls, heavy bookshelves, glass decanter untouched. He closed the door slowly, then turned to Grace. "Is it true?" She didn't hesitate this time. Her voice came out firm, even if it cracked at the edges. "Yes, I had him when I was 17. I gave him up. I didn't know it was you who adopted him until I saw him here. I took the job to be close, that's all." Jonathan didn't speak. He looked at Ethan, who sat calmly on the couch, swinging his legs and looking up at his dad like he'd said the simplest truth in the world. Grace expected judgment, maybe fury, but all Jonathan said was, "I need a minute." The silence in Jonathan's study stretched long and heavy. Grace stood still, her hands folded tightly in front of her, afraid to move, to breathe too loudly. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, eyes bouncing between the two adults like he was waiting for someone to say what came next. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "I always wondered why he trusted you so much," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Why he cried when you left the room, but not when I did." Grace looked down. "I never meant to lie to you." Jonathan nodded slowly, eyes on the floor. "You didn't lie. You just never said anything." Ethan climbed off the couch and walked over to his father. He held up the crayon drawing. "I drew this last year. I didn't show it to anyone. I didn't even know why I called her that, but now I do." Jonathan took the paper. He stared at it. Then he looked at Grace again. "I don't know what this changes. Legally, practically, I don't even know what you want." Grace stepped forward carefully. "I don't want custody. I don't want money. I just don't want to disappear." Ethan spoke up again. "I don't want her to leave." Jonathan looked between them. His jaw tightened. "This is a lot. Vanessa's not going to be—" "I don't care what she thinks," Ethan said firmly. It caught Jonathan off guard. Grace's eyes filled again, but she didn't cry. She had never seen Ethan stand so tall, so sure. Jonathan sighed. "All right, one step at a time." He didn't say she could stay. He didn't say she couldn't, but something opened, a door that had been shut for too many years. Grace finally exhaled. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was stealing moments from someone else's life. Later that evening, Grace sat alone on the back steps of the house. The celebration had dissolved into awkward small talk and filtered exits. Guests murmured, some too curious, others too polite. The wedding cake was untouched, the champagne warm. No one danced. Vanessa had locked herself in a room after the outburst. Jonathan hadn't followed her, but he hadn't said much to Grace either. She watched the garden lights flicker on as the sun dipped below the horizon. Ethan had fallen asleep upstairs after whispering, "Don't go anywhere, okay?" before curling into his blanket like nothing had changed. But everything had. Grace pulled the drawing from her apron pocket again, smoothing its creases with trembling fingers. Part of her still expected someone to come out, tell her to leave, to pack up her things, to disappear before she made the wrong people uncomfortable. A voice behind her broke the silence. "You realize what you did today just blew up a multi-million-dollar wedding," Jonathan said, half joking, half weary. Grace turned slowly. "I didn't plan any of it." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it worse." He sat down beside her, keeping some distance. They stared ahead at the empty chairs and scattered rose petals. "She thinks you manipulated him," he added after a pause. "That you planted the idea." Grace shook her head. "I didn't. I've spent years avoiding that very thing." Jonathan nodded, still unsure what to do with any of it. "I don't know how to explain this to people. To Vanessa, to our friends. It's messy, I know," Grace whispered. "That's why I stayed quiet. I never wanted to take anything from anyone." Jonathan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You didn't take anything. Ethan gave it." That sentence struck her harder than anything else, because it was true. She hadn't claimed him, she hadn't fought, she'd only loved, and today, for the first time, he'd given that love back. Out loud. She glanced at Jonathan, unsure. "What now?" He looked at her, tired but honest. "I don't know, but I'm not sending you away. Not tonight. Maybe not ever." And that was more than she ever expected. The next morning the house was still. No staff, no decorators, no music, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock in the hallway. The aftermath of the broken wedding hung in the air like fog. Grace stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. She wasn't sure if she should be packing her things. No one had said anything final. The dress she'd worn the day before was folded neatly on a chair. Her apron hung by the door. She felt untethered. A soft shuffle broke the quiet. Ethan padded into the room in his socks, hair messy, eyes still sleepy. He looked at her like he always did, without hesitation. "Can I have pancakes?" he asked. She smiled. "Of course." He sat at the table, drawing circles with his finger on the wood. "Dad said he has to call some people." He looked really tired. "I imagine he is," she said softly, flipping the first pancake. "I'm not sorry," Ethan added. She turned to face him. "I'm not," he repeated. "Even if people are mad." Grace walked over and crouched beside him. "You were very brave yesterday." He shrugged. "You just looked sad, and I didn't like it." She placed a hand gently over his. "I've been sad for a long time. Not because of you, never because of you, but because I wasn't allowed to be what I wanted most." He looked at her carefully. "My mom?" She nodded, tears threatening. He took a deep breath, like a child preparing for something big. "You still are. I mean, if you want to be." Her heart cracked open. Before she could respond, Jonathan entered the room. He looked different today. Not angry, not confused, just real. He sat at the table, looked at both of them. "I spoke to Vanessa," he said. "She's staying with her sister for now. She says I have a mess to clean up." "Maybe I do." Grace said nothing. She didn't want to push. "I don't know how to process all of this," he admitted, "but I know two things." He looked at Ethan. "You love her," then at Grace, "and she never stopped loving you." He paused, then added, "You gave up your rights once, but not your heart. That means something." Grace felt her throat tighten. Jonathan continued, "I don't know what comes next legally, emotionally, but I know this. Ethan's not confused, and neither am I." Then, for the first time, he looked directly at her. "If you're willing, I'd like you to stay, not just as help, as whatever it is we become next." Ethan's face lit up. Grace didn't move right away. She just breathed in, deep and full, like a woman surfacing after years underwater. Then she said simply, "I'd like that too." The three of them sat in silence as the pancakes browned on the stove. No contracts, no labels, just a beginning. Later that afternoon, Grace sat on the porch swing in the backyard, the same one she used to watch from the kitchen window while Ethan played in the grass. Now he was curled beside her, his head resting against her arm, completely at peace. The drawing he'd once hidden was folded neatly in his lap, like a quiet trophy of truth. The garden looked the same, but something in her had shifted. For years, she had stood behind curtains, behind doors, behind titles like nanny or helper or staff. She had accepted invisibility as her place, but now Ethan knew, and Jonathan wasn't turning away, and she finally believed she didn't have to hide anymore. She didn't need to reclaim the years lost. She just needed to be here now, fully, openly, because love, the kind that stays, that shows up through scraped knees and sleepless nights, that kind of love didn't need permission. It only needed truth. And in the end, it wasn't a lawyer or a court or a ceremony that gave her the right to be a mother again. It was a child who stood up in front of the world and said, "She's mine." Maybe someone like Grace was part of your story too. Maybe it was a teacher, a neighbor, a step-parent, or a friend's mom, someone who loved you quietly, who showed up every day without needing to be seen, who gave you more than they had, just so you'd feel safe, wanted, enough. Or maybe you were that person for someone else. If this story touched something in you, share it in the comments. Tell us who your Grace was, or who you chose to love in silence. Because sometimes the most powerful families are not the ones built by blood or law, but by devotion. And if you believe in that kind of love, the kind that waits, the kind that stays, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. We have many more stories to tell. Stories about second chances, quiet courage, and love that refuses to disappear.